Chapter 17 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 8 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 17, Louisiana Free. The admission of Michael Hahn and Benjamin F. Flanders, who were elected in December 1862 to seats in Congress, at once gave life to the political reorganization of Louisiana, and as usual also soon developed a divergence of views and action, at the bottom of which lay the inevitable question of slavery, the point at issue being the retention or abolishment of the institution in those parishes which had been excepted from the operation of the President's proclamation of emancipation. Citizens of anti-slavery views, or those willing to accept the emancipation measures, began the organization of Union associations in the city of New Orleans and adjoining territory within Federal military lines, and then by the selection of 5 delegates from each association constituted what they denominated a Free State General Committee, of which they elected Thomas J. Durant president. Upon the theory that the old Constitution of Louisiana had been destroyed by rebellion, they proposed to elect a delegate State Convention to frame a new State Constitution which should prohibit slavery. This plan was approved by Governor Shepley, who on June 12, 1863, appointed Mr. Durant Attorney General for the State, with power to act as Commissioner of Registration. The governor, under the same date, ordered a registration to be made of all free white male citizens of the United States having resided 6 months in the State and 1 month in the parish, who should take the oath of allegiance and register as a voter freely and voluntarily for the purpose of organizing a State government in Louisiana, loyal to the government of the United States. Meanwhile, the conservative citizens, though not engaging in so active an organization, sent a committee to Washington to consult the President. They wrote him a letter representing that they had been delegated to seek of the General Government a full recognition of all the rights of the State as they existed previous to the passage of an act of secession, and further requesting him to direct the military governor of Louisiana to order an election the following November for all State and Federal officers. The President replied adversely to their request. On June 19th he wrote: "Since receiving the letter, reliable information has reached me that a respectable portion of the Louisiana people desire to amend their State constitution and contemplate holding a convention for that object. This fact alone, as it seems to me, is a sufficient reason why the General Government should not give the committal you seek to the existing State constitution. I may add that while I do not perceive how such committal could facilitate our military operations in Louisiana, I really apprehend it might be so used as to embarrass them. As to an election to be held next November, there is abundant time without any order or proclamation from me just now. The people of Louisiana shall not lack an opportunity of a fair election for both Federal and State officers by want of anything within my power to give them." The reorganization of Louisiana thus begun was at this point interrupted to a certain extent by the course of military affairs. General Banks, with all the forces he could gather, was engaged in his campaign against Port Hudson, and that having been brought to a successful termination, his attention was immediately absorbed by preparations for an expedition to Texas, which the War Department had ordered. Nevertheless, the President, amid his multifarious cares, did not lose sight of the subject of reconstruction, and on August 5 wrote the general explaining his wishes somewhat in detail. Governor Boutwell read me to day that part of your letter to him which relates to Louisiana affairs. While I very well know what I would be glad for Louisiana to do, it is quite a different thing for me to assume direction of the matter. I would be glad for her to make a new constitution recognizing the Emancipation Proclamation and adopting emancipation in those parts of the State to which the proclamation does not apply. And while she is at it, I think it would not be objectionable for her to adopt some practical system by which the two races could gradually live themselves out of their old relation to each other, and both come out better prepared for the new. Education for young blacks should be included in the plan. After all, the power or element of contract may be sufficient for this probationary period, and by its simplicity and flexibility may be the better. As an anti-slavery man, I have a motive to desire emancipation which pro-slavery men do not have, but even they have strong enough reason to thus place themselves again under the shield of the Union, and to thus perpetually hedge against the recurrence of the scenes through which we are now passing. Governor Shepley has informed me that Mr. Durant is now taking a registry with a view to the election of a constitutional convention in Louisiana. This to me appears proper. If such convention were to ask my views, I could present little else than what I now say to you. I think the thing should be pushed forward so that, if possible, its mature work may reach here by the meeting of Congress. For my own part, I think I shall not, in any event, retract the Emancipation Proclamation, nor, as Executive, ever return to slavery any person who is freed by the terms of that proclamation or by any of the acts of Congress. If Louisiana shall send members to Congress, their admission to seats will depend, as you know, upon the respective houses and not upon the President. If these views can be of any advantage in giving shape and impetus to action there, I shall be glad for you to use them prudently for that object. Of course, you will confer with intelligent and trusty citizens of the State, among whom I would suggest Messrs. Flanders, Hahn, and Durant, and to each of whom I now think I may send copies of this letter. The difficulty in carrying out the President's plan was, of course, that of enlisting the active cooperation of voters to an extent which should make it a real and popular movement instead of merely the perfunctory action of military officials. There was more than ordinary party indifference and torpor resulting from war to be overcome. The territory held by Federal arms, 12 out of 48 parishes, contained more than one-fourth of all the slaves in the State, and their owners, whose property rights were yet undisturbed by military decree, could hardly be expected to join enthusiastically in the free State movement. They not only hoped for the preservation of slavery in the excepted parishes, but that the chances of war might bring about some retraction or modification of the proclamation, so as to maintain or restore the institution throughout the entire State. The absence of Governor Shepley during a part of the summer on a visit to Washington also contributed to the general inaction. Under these and other influences, the registration which had been ordered came to a practical standstill, from which it required other letters of the President to rouse it into efficient action. The first of these was to General Banks. 3 months ago today I wrote you about Louisiana affairs, stating on the word of Governor Shepley, as I understood him, that Mr. Durant was taking a registry of citizens preparatory to the election of a constitutional convention for that State. I sent a copy of the letter to Mr. Durant, and I now have his letter, written 2 months after, acknowledging receipt, and saying he is not taking such registry, and he does not let me know that he personally is expecting to do so. Mr. Flanders, to whom I also sent a copy, is now here, and he says nothing has yet been done. This disappoints me bitterly, yet I do not throw blame on you or on them. I do, however, urge both you and them to lose no more time. Governor Shepley has special instructions from the War Department. I wish him, these gentlemen, and others cooperating, without waiting for more territory, to go to work and give me a tangible nucleus, which the remainder of the State may rally around as fast as it can, and which I can at once recognize and sustain as the true State government. And in that work I wish you and all under your command to give them a hearty sympathy and support. The instruction to Governor Shepley bases the movement, and rightfully too, upon the loyal element. Time is important. There is danger even now that the adverse element seeks insidiously to preoccupy the ground. If a few professedly loyal men shall draw the disloyal about them, and tolerably set up a State government repudiating the Emancipation Proclamation and reestablishing slavery, I cannot recognize or sustain their work. I should fall powerless in the attempt. This government in such an attitude would be a house divided against itself. I have said, and say again, that if a new State government, acting in harmony with this government and consistently with general freedom, shall think best to adopt a reasonable temporary arrangement in relation to the landless and houseless freed people, I do not object. But my word is out to be for and not against them on the question for their permanent freedom. I do not insist upon such temporary arrangement, but only say such would not be objectionable to me. So also, to show his willingness to consent to any reasonable course which might bring different Union elements in Louisiana into harmonious and prompt action, Mr. Lincoln a few days later wrote the following letter to Flanders, then in Washington. In a conversation with General Butler he made a suggestion which impressed me a good deal at the time. It was that, as a preliminary step, a vote be taken, yea or nay, whether there shall be a State Convention to repeal the ordinance of secession and remodel the State Constitution. I send it merely as a suggestion for your consideration, not having considered it maturely myself. The point which impressed me was not so much the question to be voted on as the effect of crystallizing, so to speak, in taking such popular vote on any proper question. In fact, I have always thought the act of secession is legally nothing and needs no repealing. Turn the thought over in your mind and see if in your own judgment you can make anything of it. In reality, matters were not quite so dormant as had been represented to Mr. Lincoln. Governor Shepley, on October 9, had renewed his order of registration, modifying the former one so far as to admit all loyal citizens. General interest was further quickened by the announcement from certain conservative leaders of a plan to hold a voluntary election for congressmen, members of the legislature, and State officers in conformity with the old Constitution and laws of Louisiana. On the 2nd day of November, then, said their published address, go to the polls and cast your votes as usual. Your chosen congressmen will take their seats on the first Monday of December. Your chosen legislators will meet on the third Monday of January and organize. Your State officers will on the same day be inaugurated, and thus the wheels of civil government will be once more set in motion in our State. The Free State Committee met this project with resolutions denouncing it as illegal and dangerous. It turned out that the conservative movement was so weak as to be easily suppressed by military orders from Governor Shepley. The change of opinion from old things to new had been deep and strong, even under the seeming calm and inaction. Meanwhile, the general subject had received a new impetus by an extended discussion in the President's annual message of December 8, 1863, and the Amnesty and Reconstruction Proclamation which accompanied it, announcing that the President would recognize State governments reconstructed under its provisions by 1/10 the voters of insurgent States who had taken the prescribed oaths. One of the Louisiana conservatives, who was beginning to appreciate the progress of events, happened in Washington about this time, and to him Mr. Lincoln, in a letter dated December 15, elaborated his views yet more specifically. You were so kind as to say this morning that you desire to return to Louisiana, and to be guided by my wishes to some extent in the part you may take in bringing that State to resume her rightful relation to the General Government. My wishes are in a general way expressed, as well as I can express them, in the proclamation issued on the 8th of the present month, and in that part of the annual message which relates to that proclamation. It there appears that I deem the sustaining of the Emancipation Proclamation, where it applies, as indispensable, and I add here that I would esteem it fortunate if the people of Louisiana should themselves place the remainder of the State upon the same footing, and then, if in their discretion it should appear best, make some temporary provision for the whole of the freed people, substantially as suggested in the last proclamation. I have not put forth the plan in that proclamation as a Procrustean bed to which exact conformity is to be indispensable, and in Louisiana particularly I wish that labor already done, which varies from that plan in no important particular, may not be thrown away. The strongest wish I have, not already publicly expressed, is that in Louisiana and elsewhere all sincere Union men would stoutly eschew cliquism, and each yielding something in minor matters, all work together. Nothing is likely to be so baleful in the great work before us as stepping aside of the main object to consider who will get the offices if a small matter shall go thus, and who else will get them if it shall go otherwise. It is a time now for real patriots to rise above all this. As to the particulars of what I may think best to be done in any State, I have publicly stated certain points which I have thought indispensable to the reestablishment and maintenance of the national authority, and I go no further than this because I wish to avoid both the substance and the appearance of dictation. The President doubtless supposed that the various orders and letters from himself and the War Department to Louisiana officials and citizens had covered every point of necessary instruction. But at this juncture he received letters from General Banks, dated on December 6 and 16, answering his own of November 5, in which the general set forth at length that Governor Shepley, Mr. Durant, and others had given him to understand that they were exclusively charged with the work of reconstruction in Louisiana, and hence he had not felt authorized to interfere. In addition, he explained that there existed certain other officers in that department who had set up claims to jurisdiction conflicting and interfering with his own powers of military administration. The President, at length becoming annoyed that misunderstanding and contention were delaying a work which he had so plainly marked out and so persistently urged for a whole year, replied, under date of December 24, in a letter which left no doubt on the questions of authority and responsibility. Yours of the 6th instant has been received and fully considered. I deeply regret to have said or done anything which could give you pain or uneasiness. I have all the while intended you to be master, as well in regard to reorganizing a State government for Louisiana as in regard to the military matters of the department, and hence my letters on reconstruction have nearly, if not quite, all been addressed to you. My error has been that it did not occur to me that Governor Shepley or anyone else would set up a claim to act independently of you. and hence I said nothing expressly upon the point. Language has not been guarded at a point where no danger was thought of. I now tell you that in every dispute with whomsoever you are master. Governor Shepley was appointed to assist the commander of the department, and not to thwart him or act independently of him. Instructions have been given directly to him merely to spare you detail labor, and not to supersede your authority. This, in its liability to be misconstrued, it now seems was an error in us. But it is past. I now distinctly tell you that you are master of all, and that I wish you to take the case as you find it, and give us a free State reorganization of Louisiana in the shortest possible time. What I say here is to have a reasonable construction. I do not mean that you are to withdraw from Texas or abandon any other military measure which you may deem important, nor do I mean that you are to throw away available work already done for reconstruction, nor that war is to be made upon Governor Shepley or upon anyone else unless it be found that they will not cooperate with you. In which case, and in all cases, you are master while you remain in command of the department. My thanks for your successful and valuable operations in Texas. Before this letter of full authority reached General Banks, the latter had formulated a plan of action based upon the President's proclamation of December 8. I would suggest, he wrote, as the only speedy and certain method of accomplishing your object, that an election be ordered of a State government under the Constitution and laws of Louisiana, except so much thereof as recognizes and relates to slavery, which should be declared by the authority calling the election, and in the order authorizing it, inoperative and void. The registration of voters to be made in conformity with your proclamation, and all measures hitherto taken with reference to State organization not inconsistent with the proclamation may be made available. A convention of the people for the revision of the Constitution may be ordered as soon as the government is organized, and the election of members might take place on the same or a subsequent day with the general election. The people of Louisiana will accept such a proposition with favor. They will prefer it to any arrangement which leaves the subject to them for an affirmative or negative vote. Strange as this may appear, it is the fact. Of course, a government organized upon the basis of immediate and universal freedom, with the general consent of the people, followed by the adaptation of commercial and industrial interests to this order of things, and supported by the Army and Navy, the influence of the civil officers of the government, and the administration at Washington, could not fail, by any possible chance, to obtain an absolute and permanent recognition of the principle of freedom upon which it would be based. Any other result would be impossible. The same influence would secure with the same certainty the selection of proper men in the election of officers. Let me assure you that this course will be far more acceptable to the citizens of Louisiana than the submission of the question of slavery to the chances of an election. Their self-respect, their amour propre, will be appeased if they are not required to vote for or against it. Offer them a government without slavery, and they will gladly accept it as a necessity resulting from the war. On all other points, sufficient guarantees of rights, results can be secured. But the great question, that of immediate emancipation, will be covered ab initio by a conceded and absolute prohibition of slavery. Upon this plan a government can be established whenever you wish, in 30 or 60 days, a government that will be satisfactory to the South and the North. To the South, because it relieves them from any action in regard to an institution which cannot be restored, and which they cannot condemn; and to the North, because it places the interests of liberty beyond all possible accident or chance of failure. The result is certain. The President, in his various private letters to commanders and military governors, as well as in his recent message and proclamation, had uniformly said that he would not insist upon any specific plan of reconstruction as to details, provided only it conformed to a few essential conditions. He therefore immediately sent General Banks his full approval, under date of January 13, 1864. I have received 2 letters from you which are duplicates each of the other, except that one bears date the 27th and the other the 30th of December. Your confidence in the practicability of constructing a free State government speedily for Louisiana, and your zeal to accomplish it, are very gratifying. It is a connection than in which the words can and will were never more precious. I am much in hope that on the authority of my letter of December 24 you have already begun the work. Whether you shall have done so or not, please, on receiving this, proceed with all possible dispatch, using your own absolute discretion in all matters which may not carry you away from the conditions stated in your letters to me, nor from those of the message and proclamation of December 8. Frame orders and fix times and places for this and that according to your own judgment. I am much gratified to know that Mr. Dennison, the collector at New Orleans, and who bears you this, understands your views and will give you his full and zealous cooperation. It is my wish and purpose that all others holding authority from me shall do the like, and to spare me writing, I will thank you to make this known to them. General Banks, in the meantime, acting upon the President's letter, which made him master of the situation, had published on January 11, 1864, a proclamation announcing an election for State officers to be held on February 22, who shall, when elected, for the time being, and until others are appointed by competent authority, constitute the civil government of the State under the Constitution and laws of Louisiana, except so much of the said Constitution and laws as recognize, regulate, or relate to slavery, which being inconsistent with the present condition of public affairs and plainly inapplicable to any class of persons now existing within its limits, must be suspended, and they are therefore and hereby declared to be inoperative and void. He further announced that an election of delegates to a convention for the revision of the Constitution will be held on the first Monday of April, 1864, the details to be announced in subsequent orders, and that further arrangements would be made for an early election of members of Congress. The General's justification of his act appears in the following language: "The fundamental law of the State is martial law. It is competent and just for the government to surrender to the people at the earliest possible moment so much of military power as may be consistent with the success of military operation, to prepare the way by prompt and wise measures for the full restoration of the State to the Union and its power to the people." As the General's theory did not conform entirely to either the claim of the conservatives that the Constitution and laws of Louisiana existing before rebellion were completely preserved, or to the claim of the Free State Committee that they were completely destroyed, there arose some protest from both against his proceeding. But it was of such limited extent as not to reach the proportions of even a troublesome, much less a serious, obstacle. Before the day of election all the parties determined to participate in it, and 3 different tickets representing the various views were nominated. A general order of February 13 prescribed that every free white male 21 years of age, who has been a resident of the State 12 months and 6 months in the parish in which he offers to vote, who is a citizen of the United States, and who shall have taken the oath prescribed by the President in his proclamation of the 8th December, 1863, shall have the right to vote in the election of State officers on the 22nd day of February, 1864. When the day arrived, the election was held with the usual formalities in 17 parishes. An aggregate of 11,411 votes was cast, of which Michael Hahn, the candidate for governor of those who approved the measures of General Banks, received 6,183. J. Q. A. Fellows, the candidate for governor of the pro-slavery Conservatives, received 2,996, and B. F. Flanders, the candidate for governor of the protesting Free State Committee, and its adherents received 2,232. The votes for the other 6 State officers varying somewhat from these figures. The election of the 22nd February, wrote the commanding general, was conducted with great spirit and propriety. No complaint is heard from any quarter, so far as I know, of unfairness or undue influence on the part of the officers of the government. At some of the strictly military posts, the entire vote of the Louisiana men was for Mr. Flanders, at others for Mr. Hahn, according to the inclination of the voters. Every voter accepted the oath prescribed by your proclamation of the 8th December. The ordinary vote of the State has been less than 40,000. The proportion given on the 22nd of February is nearly equal to the territory covered by our arms. The election was consummated by a public inauguration of Mr. Hahn as governor on March 4, with imposing civic and military ceremonies in the presence, the general wrote, of more than 50,000 people. 8,000 pupils of the public schools participated in the ceremonies, which were intended to celebrate in this manner the return of Louisiana to the Union of States. It is impossible adequately to describe this demonstration of the people. I have witnessed many popular movements in this country, but nothing that approached this in magnitude, in enthusiasm, or popular interest. All the arrangements were by committees of citizens in which all classes were represented without the intervention of the military authorities in any manner whatever. They were magnificent and beyond all description. In further elaboration of his conception of the legal theory under which he was proceeding, General Banks explained, "It is understood by the people that Mr. Hahn represents a popular power entirely subordinate to the armed occupation of the State for the suppression of the rebellion and the full restoration of the authority of the Government. This is expressed in his oath of office. The power asked for him is that exercised heretofore by the military governor." As suggested by General Banks, the President soon after invested Governor Hahn with the powers exercised hitherto by the military governor of Louisiana. Meanwhile, he had written him a letter under date of March 13th, in which he said: "I congratulate you on having fixed your name in history as the first free State governor of Louisiana. Now you are about to have a convention which, among other things, will probably define the elective franchise. I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in, as, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. They will probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom. But this is only a suggestion, not to the public, but to you alone." It could scarcely be expected of human nature that these important proceedings should pass without some show of factious opposition. The party organized by the Free State Committee had, by formal resolution, held a convention, nominated candidates, and taken part in the election. But since their candidate for governor, Mr. Flanders, received the smallest number of votes, their ill success only increased their indignation that the management of Reconstruction had, with the President's sanction, been so summarily taken out of their hands by General Banks. They now took the ground that it was an election without validity and without moral force, and that Congress ought to declare it null and void, and their defeated candidate for governor, who was also a prominent official of the Treasury Department, used his efforts, which, to say the least, were not rebuked by Secretary Chase, to create a sentiment in Congress adverse to the recognition of the President's plan. Meanwhile, on March 11, General Banks ordered an election of delegates to a convention to be held for the revision and amendment of the Constitution of Louisiana, and Governor Hahn on March 16 gave notice to the qualified voters of the election so ordered by the commanding general. The election was held on March 28, when out of 150 delegates to which the whole State was entitled, 98 were elected and served in the convention. The total vote cast does not appear to have been published. A letter from Governor Hahn explains that the conservatives owing to their late defeat, made no formal nominations, and this, with the fact of a heavy rain on election day, was the cause of a smaller vote than before. The convention met on April 6 and continued in session until July 25. On May 11, the governor notified the President that the ordinance of emancipation without compensation was finally adopted today by a vote of 70 to 16 and is now the law of the State. The perfected Constitution was adopted in convention July 22, 1864. A letter of General Banks to the President contained the following comments on the document as a whole. The Constitution is one of the best ever penned. The convention, reviewing the circumstances under which it has labored, is entitled to the highest respect and the warmest support of the government. It was composed entirely of men of the people. There were few or none of the old leaders of opinion in public affairs. They represented, therefore, the heart of the people, and the Constitution will be generously and triumphantly sustained by them. It abolishes slavery in the State and forbids the legislature to enact any law recognizing property in man. The emancipation is instantaneous and absolute, without condition or compensation, and nearly unanimous. It confers upon the legislature the power to grant the right of suffrage to Negroes. It provides for the compulsory enrollment of all able-bodied men in the militia, without distinction of race or color. It requires the legislature to provide means for the education of all children, without restriction as to color. 12 months since, every court in this State recognized the validity of the slave code. Today, there is not a court in Louisiana that does not place every Negro upon an equal footing with the whites before the law. And the convention has wisely provided for the ultimate recognition of every right, and given them the means for qualifying themselves for every enjoyment and duty. In this progress there is marvelous success. At the beginning of the session, Negro suffrage was scarcely mentioned. Today it may be regarded as secure. A popular vote upon the Constitution was taken on the 5th of September following, when 6,836 votes were cast for its adoption and 1,566 for its rejection, being a majority of 5,270 in its favor, and the governor proclaimed, September 19, that from this date and henceforth said Constitution shall be and is ordained and established as the Constitution of the State of Louisiana. Members of Congress and a State legislature were also chosen at the election of September 5, and the latter, about a month afterwards, elected United States senators to fill existing vacancies. End of chapter 17.